Hi, welcome back to class 41 of the Life of Christ. In the earlier part of this class on Jesus and the Sabbath, we set up some of the background for the Sabbath, how God gave the law to the Israelites back in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Then we looked at how the Jews began to interpret that and obey that in different ways through their history, even up to the current day, where modern religious Jews really try to honor the spirit of the Sabbath in different ways they obey it. Now, in this part of the class, we want to see how Jesus handled the Sabbath in different stories, some of which we've seen already and some we still need to read. And then we want to see what principles Jesus underlines about keeping the Sabbath and honoring the Lord. So let's go over to several examples here that we've already seen. John chapter 5 at the pool of Bethesda, we remember the story of the paralytic that Jesus healed, and then that sparked an argument with the Pharisees. Then in John 9, Jesus healed the blind man, also on the Sabbath, more arguments with the Pharisees. And then in Capernaum, in Mark chapter 1, Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he casts a demon out of a demon-possessed man. So those are ones we've already talked about to some extent. Now let's see 4 other cases. Now it's a total of 7 Sabbath stories, which is an interesting number. Means it's pretty important for the Jewish readers of the Gospels to understand what Jesus teaches on this. And in these stories, we'll see again what's important to Jesus about keeping the Sabbath. Let's begin in Matthew chapter 12 in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath by offering sacrifices, and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Okay, so we see one example and some reasons Jesus gives for what he does on the Sabbath. Let's go to the next story, also in Matthew 12, verse 9. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Wow. Okay. Another example. Let's jump over to Luke in chapter 13, beginning in verse 10. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." Interesting, he kind of redirects and attacks the people coming to be healed instead of Jesus. But the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free from the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. And then one more example over in Luke 14, beginning in verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Kind of returning their own question to them. But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. So again, several stories through the early parts of the Gospels that for the Jews especially are striking, because it really answers a question, well, if you're from God, then how can you be doing this on the Sabbath? And they can't understand it. There's probably some that don't want to understand, like some of the Pharisees, and that no matter what Jesus does, it won't be good enough. And there's probably many Jews that honestly want to understand how Jesus can do this, because they've been taught that anything at all regarding work should not be done on the Sabbath. And they don't know how Jesus is dealing with this, okay? In this story, it's interesting that he asks them the same question they've asked him before, is it lawful? And they don't want to answer. We don't know if they weren't sure if it was lawful, because if they weren't sure, or if they thought it was a sin, then they wouldn't want to speak up and say, yes, it's lawful, when that might be teaching the wrong thing, and they're responsible to teach the right thing. Or it could be they knew it was okay, but they just didn't want to say it. Or maybe they just wanted Jesus to condemn himself in some way, and so they stay silent and hope that he traps himself. So the question is on this, did Jesus break the law when he was doing all these miracles on the Sabbath? At least 7 times he does miracles of different kinds on the Sabbath. And so for a Jew, that's a legitimate question. And I think if you look at how Jesus justifies his actions, he has several different reasons or motives for doing what he does. First of all, he says some commandments are more important than others. Okay? And you look at Jesus, through his ministry, and you see that there's a certain hierarchy to the commandments. You remember when people asked him, what are the most important commandments? And he said, love God and love your neighbor. All the rest of the law, the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. And so he prioritizes those 2. Or you have the story of the Good Samaritan that we've already mentioned before, where some of the Sadducees that passed by the wounded man on the road, they had a different priority of commandments. For them, the commandment to remain pure, to be able to serve in the temple, was more important than the commandment to love their neighbor. Okay? And so they thought, well, we have to prioritize, and unfortunately, this one is lower than this one, so we're going to keep the more important command first. And so Jesus, when he talks about serving people, human beings on the Sabbath, I mean, if you serve animals on the Sabbath, surely you can serve human beings on the Sabbath. Jesus is showing how he's prioritizing the commands. And so he's saying helping people, doing good by helping people, loving your neighbor, is more important than the command on the Sabbath. Okay? And that's actually a great justification. And there's times in life and in ministry in the church when we look around and it seems as if we have to make a choice between something that, it seems like the best thing to do and maybe stepping on the toes of a different command that would also be good to do, but not necessarily in this case. And so there are times of prioritizing. Second, Jesus said repeatedly, we just saw it in several examples here, that man is more important than the Sabbath, right? That the Sabbath is made for man, his benefit, to rest and to benefit from, and not man for the Sabbath. Although man does need to observe the Sabbath, in general, observing the Sabbath is beneficial for the man. And so Sabbath is still in man's favor. Man is more important than the Sabbath. Third, he talks about the example of David. And of course, David is one of the big heroes for the Jewish nation. And he says, look, even David, when he had a certain need, when he was hungry and he and his men might have starved, then he went in and he ate the showbread, which really only the priests are supposed to eat. But David and his men were starving. And so he says, look, again, man is more important than the Sabbath. David needed to do it to stay alive. And then he brings up the example in the Matthew 12 story about, look at the priests. They offer sacrifices on the Sabbath. Well, that technically breaks several rules about like lifting and carrying and working. And yet they're commanded to do that, to honor God on the Sabbath. And it's their job to do that, to mediate for the people, between the people and God. And so the priests can do that, and it's okay, even though technically for anybody else it would be work on the Sabbath. And then he finally mentions the other example of the children who are born, and then the 8th day, when they're supposed to be circumcised, falls on the Sabbath. Well, technically, circumcising a boy would be work. And technically, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. But in this case, the law about circumcision and honoring the pact that people have with God is more important than not working on the Sabbath. And so you look at these 5 examples, and they all show the same basic principle, that there are some things that are more important than the Sabbath. And so you need to honor God by obeying the commandments in order of their importance. And God always comes first, and then people always come next, right? And then things, and then days. And so that's part of Jesus' justification for the Sabbath. Now, you might say, well, then who is Jesus to justify his actions? In other words, okay, that's what Jesus says, that's his reasons, but I mean, does he have the rights or the authority to make these decisions? I mean, is he the guy really in charge? Can he make exceptions? And then can he give other people permission to act as he does? I mean, who is this guy anyway? Because again, some of the Jews are not sure about who Jesus is. And if they knew for sure he was God, then they would listen. But they're not convinced. And so since they're not sure he's God, and since they don't want to disobey the God they know, then they have trouble with obeying what Jesus says sometimes, okay? But if you look at these very same stories, what they have to do with about harvest and about grain and with about sacrifices and different things, it's interesting that even in these stories, you have different phrases or descriptions that actually apply to Jesus and who he is. For example, you have the one about grain. And of course, you know, the bread comes from grain, and Jesus is the bread of life, talking about eating grain. And so that's one of his titles. He is the Lord of the harvest. And again, they were talking about harvesting grain on the Sabbath. Well, I'm the Lord of the harvest, so I have authority to talk about that. He is also from the lineage of David. And so when he mentions David and says, you know, it's okay for David to do this, and I'm greater than David. And so certainly it's okay for me to do it. Or he mentions the priest who offers sacrifices. And Jesus is at the same time the priest who offers the sacrifices. He's also the lamb who dies. And then he's also the God who resurrects the lamb that sacrificed himself for everyone. And so he's greater than the priest, and he actually is the high priest and the lamb and the resurrected lamb. So interesting. All of those things are kind of allusions in these stories. And then it says he's also the Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And by the way, he also was present when God created everything. When God gave the 10 Commandments and the law to the Jews, Jesus was there with God while he was doing that. And so he says, look, I know that this is okay because I'm God. Actually, I was with God, I am God, and I know I made this. I know this would be okay to do because I was there when God and I gave this law to you. Now, he never says it that specifically, but he helps people try to understand that by what he's implying, and the Jews get it. They understand what he's saying. So about the Sabbath today, then, some people would say, okay, so what do we do with the Sabbath today? Some have suggested that perhaps we should celebrate the Sabbath today too. Maybe that's, you know, we do 9 of the other 10 commandments, right? We do 9 of them because they're reaffirmed in the New Testament. This is the only command that's not reaffirmed in the New Testament as such. And so some people have said maybe we should also keep the Sabbath. And I think it depends on how you say that. I had a neighbor come up one time, and he said, you know, our kids play youth soccer, and it turns out that this week that their games are on Sunday morning during when we normally go to church. And we really want them to be able to be part of the team and not let the team down. But we also are faithful Christians, and we don't, want to dishonor God. And so our church has a Saturday night service of worship, and we're wondering if we should go to that service on Saturday night and kind of count that, for our weekly worship, and then we can go and play soccer on Sunday morning. He said, what do you think? Because he knew I'm a minister and Christian. And so I honestly had never thought about it before. I really didn't know what to tell him. On the one hand, I thought, well, no, I mean, that's part of what you teach your kids. They can't just, go around missing church for any reason. They need to be there on Sunday morning because, people are there and they notice if you're missing and you're setting a bad example. That was part of how I wanted to react. And the other part was, well, you want to worship God all the time, right? And there's ways to balance things. That Saturday night worship is great to do, great to worship God, and honestly really hadn't thought, would God be okay with that worship because he's with other Christians and they're worshiping God together? That's a great thing. And then he'd be with his family on Sunday as well. I thought, both of those are good things. So it was a little bit confusing. I'd never really considered it before. And of course, traditionally, we celebrate the Lord's Day on Sunday because it seems to be the pattern that the early church set, like in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Paul's meeting with the Christians at Troas, and it says they met together on the first day of the week to break bread. And that's the passage we use to, talk about attending church on the first day of the week and also about taking the Lord's Supper every week. And I'm totally fine with that too. Also, we meet on Sundays because Jesus was raised from the dead on a Sunday, and so we kind of remember that and celebrate that as well. And so I have no trouble at all with worshiping on Sunday, with being with the brothers and sisters on Sunday, with obviously doing the Lord's Supper every Sunday as part of that celebration. So again, that's a good thing as well. And then I thought if you extended that example about what the early church did and how they worshiped on Sundays, you look back at Acts 2, and it says actually the early church met together every single day of the week to pray to God, to listen to teaching. They broke bread together, which could mean eating meals or maybe doing the Lord's Supper. And that could have happened every single day of the week. In other words, it's great to be able to meet together and praise God every single day. In our culture, we've kind of set aside one day because we have to work the other days, and it's hard to get off 7 days to go worship and use the whole day. And so we've kind of settled on Sundays. But if we're, going by the New Testament pattern, there is an example of people worshiping any day of the week or every day of the week. Okay? And so I think that it all comes back to what Jesus would say about what's your motivation and what are the principles that are most important behind this. And you go all the way back to Exodus 16, and part of it is to remember the Lord and to honor the Lord, to obey him, right? And part of it is to take care of yourself, to be with your family, to rest, to stop from work, because God wants to give us that gift of rest and being with our family and being with other Christians, okay? And so I wonder if, for example, should we also think about ways that we can still rest on that day? Have we filled up even Sundays so much where it's not really even a day of rest? We're kind of ignoring that part of the original command, and we're so busy that we don't really think about resting. And sometimes even all the activities we do crowds out what we do even during the worship service. Those, I think, are excellent questions. How can we honor God the best on that day? I have a friend who's an accountant, and he's decided that after a number of years that, sometimes he would go to work and Sunday afternoon after he'd been to church, and he realized he was getting more tired, and that kind of distracted him some. And so he set aside Sundays now, and he does no accounting work on Sundays. And he says that's actually helped him focus more on his family and on the Lord and honoring God on the first day of the week. And I think that kind of thinking and looking at motivations and principles is really healthy. So I think every person has to answer the question, how am I honoring the Lord one day a week? And obviously, we want to honor him every day, but in particular with other church members, with my family, the idea of resting, that idea of focusing on God, especially one day of the week. How am I doing that? In what ways? And am I being successful with it? And I think those are good conversations to have with our friends, with brothers and sisters in the faith, and with our families. So hopefully this has been helpful to you in some way. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.